Welcome back, everybody, for Audio Hour Week 12. This topic I find is often overlooked, and then can also be, if it's not overlooked, it's often overutilized. It's something that I find can make or break. Well, maybe I shouldn't say make or break, but it's something that can make a good mix all the better, and it's something that can make a basic mix sound a little bit more professional. But it's also something that could drastically damage an otherwise good mix if some of these techniques are applied incorrectly or overused. But the topic we're talking about is master bus processing. And this is not, I'm going to say right up front, this is not to be confused with mastering. Mastering is a completely distinct process from what we're going to be talking about today. But yeah, let's go ahead and switch over, get into this here. All right. So here we have a mix. We've got drums, bass, a couple guitars, a vocal, some strings, some effects. The definition of mixing, as we know, is taking these individual elements, processing each of them such that they can sound their best, both, individually as well as when combined, so that they can fit within the same dynamic and frequency space, setting their relative levels to each other and combining them. So, going from 36 channels down to 2 channels. The 2 channels are summed, meaning combined, and output through what's called the master bus, which we have here on the left. What a lot of people that might be just starting out don't think about is that the master bus can be treated as its own input sound source, in a sense, meaning we can apply the same processing or the same types of processing to our master bus as we would to any other channel. We can equalize, we can compress, things like that. The thing to understand about doing that is that any change you make applies to the entire mix. So it almost requires a different way of thinking compared to when you're mixing multitrack. When you're mixing multitrack and you're listening back, you're listening for the relationships of the parts, both in terms of relative level and frequency overlap, listening for any masking or overlap interference in the frequency spectrum. But when you finish that and you're happy with your multi-track mix and you can hear every part and it's distinct in its placement, in terms of dynamic and frequency and stereo image, and it's all combined to your master, there are certain things you can do that might make your finished product all the better. Firstly, I'm going to talk about some of the basic things, and then I'll get into what I myself have just gotten into the habit of doing. In general, the most common type of master bus processing is compression. Why is that? Well, when you're mixing multi-track and you're combining all these elements, there can sometimes be a tendency for the summation of those elements to sound disparate, perhaps. Basically, the logic behind using bus compression is sometimes when you do a multi-track mix, it plays back and it sounds okay, but it sounds like, 40 different instruments playing together as opposed to one band playing together. One of the ways that you can, quote, glue a mix together is by utilizing some subtle compression. So first stage of that is this. This is a VCA compressor. This particular one is modeled off of the SSL G series, which is just kind of a legendary analog modeled master bus compressor that was integrated into SSL studio consoles. This is just a emulation of that. But again, VCA compression, so fairly versatile, fairly transparent. Let me just go ahead and mute out all of these here. And I'll play back the track here. So, nothing wrong really with the mix. You can hear all the parts. The parts sound okay together. Nothing's really interacting with anything else in an untoward way. But if I were to cycle on this bus compression, listen for the effect. The thing you're going to notice most is kind of a smoothing effect across all the parts. You're going to notice that the effects tails, like the reverb tails, are going to be have a little less trouble competing for being audible, but not in a way that competes with the dry signals. You're going to notice that the vocal sits with the band a little closer. Here's that. It's a subtle effect, but listen for it, and I think you'll hear it. Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now. You also notice that it kind of focuses the low end, like that kick drum gets a little clearer. It sits with the bass, a little more roundly. So what this is doing, if we look at the settings here, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, so really low ratio. Really slow attack, 30 milliseconds. So it's really not touching any transients at all. This is only addressing, the actual sustain of the notes that are happening. Kind of a medium release for, bus compression. Typically, you don't want to use super quick releases unless you're going for a certain effect. But using 600 milliseconds of a release, and then I'm adding just a little bit of makeup gain back, 2 decibels. And then just brought my threshold down just low enough to be touching it. Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had. So you see, it's only reducing maybe 3 decibels of gain. But it's really transparent. It doesn't sound like it's, again, because of how slow the attack is. This is a really smooth kind of transparent compression, but it is making this mix sound a little bit more cohesive, a little less as a collection of elements, and a little bit more like one thing, like one finished product. So like a stereo bus compression is kind of like the most common type of master bus processing. For me, one thing I like to do is take the compression one step further, and after my initial bus compression, use a multiband compressor. And what this allows me to do is, we talked about this plugin when we were talking about lead vocal processing. So if we remember, what this allows us to do is break the frequency spectrum into a couple bands, a couple specific ranges, and basically have independent compression settings of each frequency range. So in general, I'm thinking lows, on the first band, mids, low mid, mids on the second band, upper mids, like your clarity, and then your highs, like your air. So it's basically, if you want to put adjectives to it, it's your thump or your weight, your fundamental body warmth, your clarity, and your sheen, your sparkliness. And I can just solo these up here. So I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not set over. I spent so much time. All right, so I've broken our frequency spectrum into 0 to 120 hertz. 120 hertz to 1800 hertz, 1800 hertz to 6K, and 6K to infinity. So again, similar to the thought process when we were talking about lead vocal processing, we're going to be compressing, and again, it's fairly transparent. I'm really not clamping down on anything too hard, except for the highs, where there's really not much dynamic information anyway. Compressing these just a tad in a very relaxed, passive sort of way, just to smooth them out even further after the bus compression, and then I can make some level adjustments to these specific ranges. So what you'll notice is this is going to tame any lingering boxiness in the low mids. It's going to allow me to accentuate like the intelligibility of the parts with my upper mids. It's going to add a little bit more weight to my bottom end, and it's going to add a little bit more shine to the overall mix with the air. The other nice thing is that because it's tailored to each specific range, I find that this kind of, I wouldn't say adds, but accentuates or enhances the musicality of the whole mix, just because it kind of breathes dependent on the frequencies that are, coming out, as opposed to just transient information, which is a little bit more black and white. This to me is a little bit more of a musical effect. So I'll cycle this on and off. Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not set over our painted sky. So here, the word I keep coming back to is it breathes better. It just kind of opens up. That top end comes out. The bottom end is more present, but it's not out of control. That the vocal and that lead guitar, are shining through really clearly, but aren't masking anything else. Like I said, it just makes it sound more musical to me.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to.
So those are this multi-band compressor in tandem with just a stereo bus compressor. As far as I'm concerned, are all the more compression stages that you would want to add to a master bus. And that kind of allows me to segue into a point that's important to note here. Every change that you make with a processor on the master bus should be extremely subtle. If it isn't, like if you're finding that you need to compress a lot harder, or we're going to get into EQ next, if you need to make frequency changes beyond 1 or 2 decibels, you probably need to revisit your mix. There's probably an issue that would be better fixed with actually addressing that issue within the mix, whatever that may be. To me, master bus processing, like I said, it's just supposed to make the overall product a little bit more cohesive and a little bit more polished as a whole. It's not really supposed to be fixing issues. If there are issues, they should be addressed in the mix. Really don't want to be going after specific things on the master bus because, like I said, that affects everything. So you might fix an issue, like say, the snare is just obnoxiously loud. So you might wind compression way down and it fixes it. The snare sits better, but then everything else in addition to the snare is going to be crushed. It's going to suck the life and the loudness out of your mix. So it would be better to maybe either compress a little bit more aggressively on the snare channel, or address the frequency of the transient of the snare with an EQ, or just turn it down. There are a number of ways that you can address that specifically, more surgically, more transparently on the snare channel itself, or whatever the offending channel may be, rather than trying to get it on the master bus. So always very subtle changes. And if you feel yourself wanting to make a change that's not subtle, ask yourself once or twice, like, is there a way I could fix this in the mix? I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead because there are some other things I do to my master buses outside of your standard mix functions of equalization and compression. And I'll get into those, but I want to preface those a little bit. But first, I want to get into my EQ. So, same principle. Sometimes it's nice to set a frequency response curve for your entire mix to play through. This, to me, is kind of like a... How do I want to say it? Sort of like a last check on yourself. So I find that as I'm building a mix from start to finish, I find that sometimes, because you're listening in such a specific way, you're listening for interaction of parts and overlap of parts, and trying to address that at the individual level. Sometimes that way of thinking makes it easy to miss things that might occur over the course of the mix, like day to day. Like you might be working for a week, like every day for a week on a mix, and your brain's just going to start getting used to how that sounds. And sometimes you'll go ear blind to certain things that are accruing in your mix or are deficient in your mix in terms of frequency. So one thing I like to do is, after I've built my multi-track mix, maybe take, a couple days away from it and then come back, listen to it, and see if there are any overall frequency anomalies that I think could be cleaned up or enhanced by an equalization stage. When I'm mixing, I don't want to have to use an EQ on my master bus, but like I said, sometimes it's just a nice kind of safety net, just in case there are just little areas that may have stacked up as you've gone, or areas that might have gotten cut a little too hard as you've gone. And again, I'm talking minuscule changes here. Like if you look at my gain changes up here, the biggest cut is 2.4 decibels. All of my boosts are 1 decibel, maybe a couple decimal places more than that, but it's very, very minuscule changing. One thing that I will almost always use an EQ stage for is to address my low end on the master bus. So the reason for this is I, like I'm sure most of you, are typically mixing on near field monitors in an untreated room. And because of that, I recognize that I am most likely not getting the most accurate reference of all the low end information in my mix. There's certain stuff within this that my speakers aren't going to replicate. There's certain things within this that my room is probably going to either cancel out or just not reproduce at all. I can compensate that by using headphones that have a lower frequency pickup, which does help, and I do recommend that. But even that will only get you so far, because that's not giving you a representation of what that low end is going to do in actual airspace. So in general, the most common issue is that you're going to have more low end information than you realize in the bottom of your mix. And this can be an issue when you go to mastering, and if it goes unaddressed, then it can cause playback to be distorted, or sometimes it can actually make an overall track sound quieter, because like if you go to a streaming service or any sort of playback system that has a safety limiter on it, or in the case of a streaming service, any kind of broadcast normalization, that low end information that you may not hear is probably going to hit that before the rest of your mix. So the rest of the mix is going to be perceived as being turned down. Suffice it to say, there's just a lot of badness that can occur from having unaddressed low end go by. So one way to combat that, first of all, is with a frequency meter. So if I mute this and I play back my mix through a meter,
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to.
So if we remember from our previous episodes, I've talked about how ideally you want your RTA to read out as a mostly flat line. So we can see here, even without EQ, it's pretty close. We do have a little bit of a deficiency here in the low mids. We do have a little bit of a deficiency here in the upper mids, and our top end kind of goes away pretty quick. Our low end really doesn't look too bad, although, you know, this from here down might be a little bit more than we may want, especially for this kind of music, this style of music, being kind of folk. So these are all things that we can address with an EQ stage on the master bus. Also, just while I'm on this point, I typically always load up a frequency analyzer on the last insert of my master bus, just to kind of reference as I go. I don't depend on it. You kind of want to be able to trust your ears. But like I said, as you're sitting with a mix for longer periods of time, your brain's going to start getting used to certain things about it. So I just, maybe once a day as I'm working on it, I'll make sure that I check an RTA, just to make sure that there's nothing crazy going on that I don't know about. So with this, I'm going, okay, I might want to attenuate some of this low end so that later on in mastering, if I want to make the low end louder, or the mastering engineer wants to make the low end louder, they can do that without it getting muddy or distorted, or without freaking out, you know, lower end playback systems. So I'm going to address this low end, bring it down a little bit most likely. I want to add a little bit back in this range. I also might, I'm looking here in the middle, and it's kind of a dense range here, so I might want to cut a little bit up here. I'm probably going to want to add a little bit back here. And then I'm probably going to want to add some high information here. So that's what I have done with this EQ curve. Rolling off the low end, slight, like super slight boost in the lower mid range, cut in the middle range, slight boost in the upper mids, tiny little cut here, just because when I shelved up on my high end, this top end of the sibilant range got a little out of hand in my opinion, so I just pulled that back just a little bit just to kind of shape my shelving. One note I do want to make is I find that, and I've just made this mistake enough times to know now, when attenuating excess low-end energy on your master bus, it's better to use shelving rather than a high pass, because you probably don't want to remove low-end information entirely, because that can lead to problems of its own with whether it's phase shifting of the entire mix or just like a perceived hole in the bottom end. Those aren't things that you want. So I find that a shelving EQ tends to be a little more transparent, because it's leaving all the frequencies in, it's just rolling them off, as opposed to cutting them. So let me show you what this is doing. So here's without it.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not.
So right away, the biggest thing that you'll probably notice is this cut here in the middle. For me, I find that this is a range that it's really easy to go ear blind to over time. Your brain, I feel, because this range is present in pretty much every sound, I find, and I'm only speaking from my own experience, but I find that my brain is faster to write off this frequency range. I have to be a little bit more conscious in my observations of it. So right away you can tell that this mix is being shaped pretty significantly just by this little cut here at around 1,000 hertz. You may not be able to hear the low end attenuation on your playback system, but it's there. And then to compensate for that, and as well as, like, you know, there was the deficiency spot anyway in our RTA, adding a little boost here in the lower mid, little boost here in the upper mid, and just a little bit of shine up in the top end.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had.
And you can hear how even just this subtle little change, like, really has a nice, desirable effect on the actual, like, the shape of this mix. I don't know. It's just, again, it's just kind of like that last stage that can make this that much better, just by strategically adding or subtracting like 1 decibel at a time. So just to kind of give you a sense of how subtle strategic EQ and compression stages can affect your overall mix, I'll bring these in here.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not set over our painted sky. And I don't know why I spent so much time trying to push away.
So, you know, you can tell that that's a subtle improvement. There wasn't really anything drastically wrong with the mix before we made those changes, but now it sounds a little bit more polished, a little bit more as one unit, a little more unified. And for most intents and purposes, that will be plenty. Sometimes, though, you might find, especially in fully digital setups like the one that I'm in, like the one I'm sure most of us are in, you'll find that, again, very judiciously and subtly, the master bus might be an opportunity to add some coloration effects as well. A predominant criticism of mixing exclusively digitally, and this obviously is a point of much contention and consternation in the audio community, is the most common criticism is that the resulting product sounds sterile. For me, I feel like that is 98% not true. If you're a good engineer, you can make anything sound good, whether that's digital, analog, whatever you're presented with. If you know how to use the tools, you can get a good sound, regardless of whether that the medium is digital or analog. There is a minuscule nugget of truth to that buzzword belief that I'm going to get into at the end of this episode. But for the most part, when people say that, and this is just my opinion, and this might be a controversial statement, but I feel like that's an excuse for just poor engineering capabilities, digital or otherwise. When people talk about analog being better, I think a lot of that is just due to the fact that analog, specifically analog tape, like analog storage media, masked a lot of things, a lot of imperfections that digital doesn't hide, that digital is able to replicate with greater accuracy. So that, to me, I feel like is more the rationale for that. But like I said, if you feel you're a capable engineer, then you should welcome the greater accuracy. As you know, most of the engineers that I admire that are, you know, have been working for decades and are still working, they've all embraced digital technology in varying degrees for that reason, because of the greater accuracy that it affords. But that being said, in order to add some color across the entire mix, which is an admitted benefit that's kind of built into analog, I have gotten in the habit of using two effects, or not effects, but two processors in my master bus chain that kind of provide that. The first of which is this. And again, I want to preface, I know we talked about this in the early weeks, but I am never going to advocate for getting impulse buy happy or purchase happy or obsessed with buying, you know, every kind of digital plug-in. The vast majority of them are going to function more or less the same way. You know, I'm a big proponent of finding gear that you like and learning it really well and using it. You will ultimately be more versatile with one EQ that you know really well than with 6 different EQs. That said, this is, you know, what might be considered a gimmicky digital plugin, but I found that I enjoy what it does to my mixes when I apply it subtly. This is made by Waves. It's called the Cobalt Saphira, and what it does is it's sort of like a tape simulator, and it's sort of a saturator, and it's sort of a harmonic generator. The main thing that I like about it is the harmonic generation that it lets you do. And the way it does that is it takes the frequency that's coming through it, analyzes it, and figures out where certain harmonics would sit in that frequency range, and it uses special like filters to give you level control of harmonics. And you have independent control of odd harmonics, like first, third, fifth, seventh, and your even order harmonics, your second, your fourth, your sixth. It breaks up your frequency spectrum that's coming through it, and gives you fader control of basically driving those harmonic ranges. Additionally to that, it also gives you a couple different curves for your harmonics in terms of the gain that they have as you bring up the fader of each of the orders. So, you know, here's your first order, your third order, fifth order, second, fourth, sixth, relative to the F, which is fundamental. The other nice thing about this plugin is it gives you the ability to set EQ curves for those harmonics. This isn't for the actual fundamental frequencies. This is only for the harmonics that you're accentuating. So here I've just tailored the frequency contributions that I want out of both of these harmonic ranges. And then I've set my blends here. There's also a little bit of a like I said, the tape simulator, which kind of allows, it simulates the effect of having your media actually moving as it's being recorded, which to me adds kind of like a subtle sense of motion to the mix as a whole, and it kind of helps in tandem with the harmonics. It kind of helps with stereo separation. Like I find that the parts of the mix become more distinct. It's kind of, I know that's a long-winded way to describe it, but let me just show you what it's doing.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not set over.
Again, this is an extremely subtle change here, but where I find it most noticeable is in its ability to make parts more distinct in the stereo field, adding separation. So like, I'll start it again. Listen to the two guitar parts and the drum kit. Like, pay attention to those with this off, and then when I cycle it on, pay attention to what happens to them.
Saw was a pause in the heavy hand of time. This dream that I had, I will hold to for a while now, of a sun that would not set over our painted sky. And I don't know why I spent so much time trying to push away, when all that I really wanted was for you to stay.
It improves the overall clarity to me. It's in a way, if you want to think of it this way, it's like with your compression stages, you're making your overall mix more cohesive. And then with this, you're sort of compensating for any losses of individual clarity in the parts, because the harmonics are what give each instrument its unique timbre. So this kind of ensures that it's not becoming so cohesive that it's unclear, that the parts are still distinct from each other, but still cohabitate in such a way that it sounds like one unit. And then we're coming out of this into our EQ curve, because all of these things are changing the frequency balance slightly. So EQ here after all of those. The one more thing that I've gotten in the habit of doing is adding, again, this might be another gimmicky digital plugin, also made by Waves. This is an emulation of an analog piece of gear called the Aphex Aural Exciter. Basically what this is it takes your total mix, high passes up to, like, to me it sounds like 4,000 hertz, drives everything that's left, and then allows you to add that back to your existing mix. So basically it's like a high frequency overdrive, sort of. It gives you two colorations within that. Here, actually, I can just kind of demonstrate by isolating. So here's the regular mix.
Spent so much time trying to push away, when all that I really wanted was for you.
So that is what. Here, hold on. That's what the plugin is pulling out and affecting. But then on your mix, you're able to set the blend of, you know, the unaffected mix to the affected mix. So to me, this just adds a little bit more brightness, a little bit of, well, it's called an exciter. It adds the air sheen frequencies that can make something feel exciting. Here's what it's doing.
Spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really wanted was for you to stay.
So you hear it like it's lifting those vocals up. It's letting the cymbals hang around just a little longer. It's letting you hear the sound of the guitarist's fingers on the string, like their right hand plucking the strings. All those kind of intimate elements of a mix, it's just accentuating those. Again, this mix would be totally fine without that. And again, this is a very subtle manipulation of it, but you know, this is just something that I like to do. It's a habit I've gotten into. It's a system that I like, and I think it does make a good mix just a little bit better before it's finalized. So overall, if I strip all these off, the full effect of the tasteful, strategic master bus processing is.
Spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really wanted was for you to stay.
And there you have it. Again, very subtle change from no processing to all of the processing. And that's what you want. Because again, if it's a more drastic change, then there's probably something wrong with the mix. And, it's always going to be better to address that rather than try to mitigate it with the master bus. You can fix things in the mix. You can't fix things from the master bus. You can only mitigate things, and that's always going to be at the expense of other elements of the mix that don't have any issues in them. One other thing I want to just mention here is another habit I've gotten into when mixing, and this is referring to multitrack mixing as opposed to master bus processing. I've gotten in the habit of just having a limiter like inserted on the master bus. I usually have it bypassed for 99% of the time. This is another thing, kind of like my RTA, that I like to have just to check. And the reason for that, and we'll get into this kind of later on, but limiting is a big function of mastering. So there are times in mixing where, if I'm vacillating on a move, whether that's a frequency move or a fader balance or something, and I want to give myself a glimpse of how that might translate in a mastering situation. I'll have this limiter like kind of on standby, and then I'll check it. I'll turn the limiter on and see how my various moves translate. This obviously is kind of a shortcut. It's not slapping this limiter on is not going to give me an accurate picture of what the full mastering will do, but it will give me just kind of a reference for how it's most likely to behave. I find that this is most useful in checking the relationships of mono elements to stereo elements, like particularly vocals to rhythm section. Let me show you just kind of what I mean here. Also just watch your volumes. This is gonna have a little bit of a bump in loudness as I set it.
Spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really wanted was for you.
So say I'm mixing my multi-track and I've got my lead vocal, just for example, here.
Spent so much time trying to push away.
But, you know, say as I was putting this mix together, maybe I wanted the vocal. Oh, it's not going to let me do it because this is an automated mix, which we'll talk about next week.
Spent so much time.
Okay, here's an equivalent example. I've got my snare drum.
Spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really want.
Right, so they're doing the cross stick. And it's, you know, it might be perceived as kind of quiet at the moment, on the quieter side. So maybe as I was mixing, maybe I brought this up like to here.
Spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really wanted.
So again, this is a mono element in reference to, you know, well, other mono elements like the kick, bass, and lead vocal, and then all of my panned elements. And that sounds okay too. I've bumped it up 1.8 decibels on the fader.
Spent so much time.
You know, it's more out front, more behaving like a stereotypical snare drum. But if I was unsure about how that might translate,
Spent so
in terms of after mastering, I can throw this limiter stage on it and just check. So
spent so much time trying to push away when all that I really wanted.
And that exposes to me that nope, that is too loud. That is going to be obnoxious and way too out front when this song gets mastered. So what we talked about before is like actual processing that I put on my master bus, but then I also am just in the habit of always having an RTA and a limiter bypassed just for me to reference as I'm mixing. Like, you know, if there's some frequency area that's giving me trouble, I can reference this, or just at the end of the day, just to make sure that I haven't unknowingly done anything weird because of imperfect monitoring environment or my ears just going blind to certain things. I can reference it on the RTA, and if there's anything where I can't tell which one is better, like which between two alternative moves is better, I can usually check it on the limiter, and it suggests one or the other. But yeah, that is my rundown of considerations in master bus processing. Come back next week at the same time for week 13 on a full mix rundown. We're going to be talking about everything we've talked about so far in this series. Individual channel processing, fader balancing, stereo imaging, application of time-based effects, how all those effects are summed, and the processing that happens once they have been summed on the master bus, and finalizing a mix. So come on back then, and good luck in the meantime.